It was a calm evening on the brink of beginning. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the house with a serene and peaceful ambience. Everything around was as quiet as usual. I was preparing dinner, anticipating my husband Jack's return any moment. Our son Stem, now 20, stood before me, a tall and mature young man. I could vividly recall every step he took and word he spoke during his childhood. Yet, as he grew older, I found myself understanding him less and less. At one point, while turning to glance at him, I noticed his eyes lingering intently on me. His gaze froze momentarily, fixating on my neck, shoulders, and chest, which unsettled me. After dinner, we sat down to watch television, a typical family activity, though my father hadn't yet returned. Even in that familiar setting, my mind replayed the moment of his stare. I was flooded with unsettling thoughts, grappling with the realization that I no longer saw him as the little boy who once played beneath the table. Instead, he was now an adult, a man. This realization disturbed me, and I tried to suppress it, but it began to consume more of my attention. The dim light filtering through the windows, the romantic film playing quietly in the background, all of it created the comforting atmosphere I cherished. Yet suddenly, Stem shifted closer, almost unnoticeably. His hand brushed against mine, sending shivers down my spine. An electric sensation coursed through me, leaving me startled and confused. Reacting impulsively, I leapt to my feet as though warding off intrusive thoughts. My heart raced, and I retreated to the kitchen for a cold glass of water, attempting to calm my emotions. From the couch, Stem called out in a calm voice, "Mom, are you okay?" Though his tone was steady, I detected a hint of concern. "I'm fine," I replied hastily, masking my embarrassment. "Just tired." Returning to the living room, I deliberately sat at the far edge of the couch, striving to compose myself. We continued watching the movie, now in utter silence. My heart pounded, and my thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. I reminded myself of the immense love I had for my son, and how I had poured my soul into raising him. But something inside me was shifting, disrupting the ideal image I had worked so hard to uphold. After roughly 15 minutes, I stood up abruptly and announced, "I'm going to bed. Stay and enjoy yourself." My attempt to smile faltered, and my voice betrayed me. Once in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. I struggled to rationalize it. "It's just fatigue. A strange illusion," I told myself, but the more I dwelled on it, the more I realized I had crossed an invisible boundary. I didn't want to feel this way or entertain such thoughts. It wasn't normal. The next morning, I followed my routine, but a sense of unease lingered. Entering the kitchen, I found Stem seated at the table, calmly eating a bacon roll and sipping coffee. On the other side of the table, my breakfast was already laid out. Surprised, I paused and remarked with a smile, "You really caught me off guard." Internally, I felt a jolt as my legs quivered slightly. I tried to maintain composure, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense that I was right. My thoughts had consumed me. I began to seriously consider whether it was time to see a counselor. Stem looked up, cheerfully greeting me, "Good morning, Mom," in such a normal tone that I felt a sudden wave of relief. Perhaps it truly was just my imagination. I debated whether to broach the subject or manage it on my own. His presence was steadying, like a source of strength in moments of uncertainty. "This is my son," I reminded myself, taking a deep breath. To distract myself, I asked, "Stem, could you help me today?" My voice wavered slightly, though I tried to sound casual. "Of course, Mom," he responded without hesitation, as if everything was perfectly normal. I wasn't entirely sure why I had asked. Perhaps I just needed to redirect my mind and escape my unsettling thoughts. I scolded myself internally. "This is enough. Calm down." It was just a simple outing, nothing more. An hour later, we were driving in the pickup truck, enjoying a beautiful day. The air was crisp, the weather ideal, and the sky stretched out in a brilliant shade of blue. The atmosphere felt so calm that I felt embarrassed for the absurd thoughts I had entertained the previous night. We chatted casually about his parties, new friends, and his life as an adult. It was the kind of light-hearted conversation that warmed my heart and filled me with pride. Hearing his stories brought me so much happiness, and laughter soon filled the car. Suddenly, he shouted excitedly, "Stop, stop, Mom! Let's stop here. Look how amazing it is." His arms flailed with enthusiasm, his eyes sparkling with delight. I laughed, caught up in his carefree excitement, and gave in. All right, you win. Just don't yell like that," I said as I slowed the car and pulled over. We climbed out of the truck, stepping into the serene embrace of the forest. The silence of nature surrounded us, and the fresh, clean air filled my lungs. bringing a moment of absolute peace. Closing my eyes, I let myself savor the stillness, until I sensed Stem moving closer to me, almost pressing against me. Startled, I opened my eyes to find his face mere inches away. His expression carried something unfamiliar, something I hadn't seen before. "Mom," he murmured softly, his tone carrying a new, unrecognizable quality. "You know how much you mean to me, right?" His words sent a shiver through me, accompanied by an incomprehensible feeling that left me uneasy. That same forbidden sensation swept over me again, and I looked at him, struggling to maintain composure. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, attempting to sound steady, though I felt turmoil inside. "You're my son. You're the most important person in my life." I instinctively stepped back, needing space. "I love you so much. You're the most precious thing in the world to me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. A single tear slipped down my cheek as I realized how strange it felt to hear those words from him, simultaneously unsettling and oddly touching. "Yes, me too. I love you too," I managed to say, barely keeping my emotions in check. He gripped my hand tightly, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me tremble. Fear gripped me like an unwelcome intruder, tightening every muscle in my body. My voice came out as a faint whisper. "Do you feel fear and embarrassment?" I asked, barely audible, knowing every word I spoke could shatter the fragile moment. He didn't reply right away, but something unfamiliar flickered in his eyes. "That's not it. Or maybe it is," I stammered, my words faltering. I struggled to express how everything I felt had built an invisible barrier between us, one that couldn't be crossed. "It's not supposed to be like this," I added, searching desperately for words that wouldn't hurt him or destroy the moment. "I'm not afraid or embarrassed," he said evenly, his tone calm but carrying a weight of inevitability. "I'm just speaking the truth. It can't be any other way. This is how I feel." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet sorrow in it that struck me deeply. "Please, let's stop this," I whispered, trying to keep my composure even as my emotions felt ready to explode. Inside, everything screamed for control as I struggled to understand what he was feeling and how to guide him through it. My mind raced, searching for the right words, but none seemed adequate. "You see," I finally managed, my throat tightening painfully. "I love you, but as my son. We can't ruin what we have between us. Our love is pure and it has to stay that way. Please understand." I saw his expression shift, a mixture of disappointment, hurt, and perhaps reluctant understanding. His head dropped, resembling a child chastised for wanting something out of reach. In that moment, he seemed as young as when I used to scold him for leaving his toys scattered on the floor. A wave of pain coursed through me. How could I have let myself see him in this way? "Stem," I began, but no more words would come. Instead, I led him back to the truck, and we climbed in without a word. The drive back was long, each moment weighed down by the silence between us. Though only 15 or 20 minutes passed, it felt like an eternity. Eventually, I turned the truck around, knowing I couldn't continue to my friend's house. Our thoughts were muddled, and it felt pointless to keep going. I realized the only place we could go was home, where we might find some semblance of normalcy again, or at least try to. When we returned home, he leapt out of the car before I even had a chance to switch off the engine and vanished into his room. A wave of frustration and sorrow swept over me with fresh intensity. How had it come to this? How had we reached this point? I had always strived to be the best mother possible, pouring all my love into raising him, supporting him at every step. I worked hard to shape him into a strong, courageous man, ensuring he wouldn't grow overly dependent on me. I gave him everything, my heart, my care, my energy, sometimes forgetting that I too was just a person who needed love and support. Now as everything crumbled, the pain was unbearable. Throughout the day I attempted to approach him, to engage him in chores, to offer my help, or simply to talk. Yet every time he avoided me, shutting me out completely and refusing to meet my eyes. By the time night fell, I lay in bed overwhelmed by guilt. How could I have shattered his world and hurt his feelings so deeply? All I had ever wanted was his happiness, but I had ended up causing him pain instead. Lying in the dark, I could hear my heart pounding in the silence. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. My breath caught. It was him. I silently begged that he wouldn't knock again, wouldn't step inside, wouldn't break this fragile stillness. I wanted to pretend I was asleep, to avoid the confrontation, but I knew that would only hurt him more.
The weight of the moment was crushing, unbearable. I didn't want this to continue, yet I gestured for him to come in. He hesitated at the doorway before slowly stepping closer. I pulled the blanket up over me, as if it could shield me from what was about to unfold. Stem stood in front of me, motionless, his eyes locked on mine. The silence between us stretched endlessly, until he finally sat down at the edge of the bed. "Mom, I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low and filled with regret. "I shouldn't have said what I did tonight, but I just couldn't hold it in anymore. That pain, that feeling, it's been tearing me apart inside." I stared at him, shaking my head slowly, unable to find the words to respond. I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of making the situation even worse. My mind was a tangled mess. How long had he felt this way? How had we ended up in this impossible situation? Yet at the same time, I could feel the depth of his torment, a pain that not only confused him, but was now consuming me as well. Beneath the blanket, I clenched my fists, searching desperately for something to say that might ease his anguish. But nothing came. Instead, I reached out and embraced him. Fear and guilt gripped me tightly as I held him close, clinging to him as though I feared he might vanish forever. In that moment, I realized how profound my fear of losing him truly was. I gripped his hand tightly, as if that alone could protect us from what had already happened and from whatever lay ahead. For a few minutes, we sat there silently, the world around us seemingly frozen. Then, slowly, he stood up, as though burdened by an invisible weight, and returned to his room without saying a word. I didn't try to stop him. It felt as though, if I let go of his hand for even a second, I wouldn't be able to hold on to him anymore. And yet he left anyway. The next morning, when I came downstairs, I found him sitting on the couch with his elbows resting on his knees. His expression was sorrowful, both familiar and strange at once. He looked at me, but the warmth I had grown accustomed to in his gaze over the years was gone. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, his voice steady but each word like a blow to my chest. "I've packed my things. I'll be living nearby." His tone was neutral, free of accusation or resentment, but his words hit me like 1,000 shards of glass. My heart broke into pieces, leaving me hollow. I opened my mouth to speak, to stop him, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. All the emotions I had suppressed, misunderstanding, sorrow, regret, came rushing forward, leaving me unable to articulate anything. He left, and I didn't try to hold him back. It wasn't until the door closed behind him that I realized the gravity of the moment. That day marked a turning point, a shift that changed everything forever.